I still drive the Midnight Express. Every single night I climb into that engineer's cab and guide 300 tons of steel through the darkest hours of the New York rail system. People ask why I haven't quit. The truth is, someone has to bear witness to what happens on these tracks. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 38 years old, and I've been an overnight train driver for 12 years. It's not the kind of job people dream about as kids, but it found me after I left the Army. Something about the solitude, the routine, the clear objective of getting from point A to point B appealed to me. No crowds, no office politics, just me, the train, and the dark. The Midnight Express, officially Line 7 Extended, runs from Grand Central Terminal to the northern Bronx, then loops back through maintenance tunnels most New Yorkers don't know exist. It's a graveyard shift route, servicing night workers, insomniacs, and people who live in the city's shadow hours. 6 passenger cars, built in the 80s and refurbished just enough to meet safety standards. The train smells like old metal, recycled air, and decades of human passage. I know every inch of this route, every curve, every gradient, every sound the wheels make on different sections of track. That kind of knowledge comes from repetition. 430 nights a year for 12 years. You learn to read the train through vibrations to know when something's off before any warning light flashes. My routine was sacred. Systems check at 11:47 p.m., passenger boarding from 11:55 to 12:10, departure at exactly 12:15. The most critical part of the journey comes 42 minutes in. When we enter the long tunnel, a 15-mile stretch beneath the Bronx, with no stops, no stations, just darkness and the rhythmic clatter of steel on steel. Carlos Martinez, my conductor, had been working this route almost as long as I had. Solid guy, early 50s, brought homemade food to share during breaks. He managed the passenger cars while I focused on navigation. We had maybe 24 regular passengers, the same faces week after week. You start to recognize them, even learn their patterns. The nurse who always sat in car 3, the janitor who dozed in car 5, the businessman who took cabin 3 once a month for his upstate meetings. 3 months ago, everything changed. It was an October Tuesday, unseasonably cold. I remember shivering in the cab, watching my breath fog the windshield. We had 43 passengers that night. I always know the exact count. It's required for dispatch reports. 43 souls trusting me to get them safely through the dark. The first 7 stops went smooth. By the time we entered the long tunnel at 1:03 a.m., we were down to 37 passengers, 6 of them in the sleeper cabins trying to catch rest before their connections. At 1:19 a.m., 16 minutes into absolute darkness, Carlos's voice crackled over the intercom. "Marcus, we might have a situation." That's where it began. "What kind of situation?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. In 12 years, Carlos had never used those words lightly. "Cabin 3. The businessman, Hendricks. He's not here." "What do you mean, not here? Did he get off at one of the stops?" There was a pause. I could hear the ambient noise of the train through the intercom, the rhythmic clatter, the low hum of ventilation. "Marcus, we're in the tunnel. There haven't been any stops. I checked this cabin 17 minutes ago during my first round. He was asleep. Now the cabin's empty." My hands tightened on the controls. "I'm coming back. Keep the cabin sealed." I engaged the autopilot, a system I rarely used, but the tunnel was straight and the track clear. The walk from the engine cab to car 6 takes about 3 minutes at normal pace. I made it in 2, my mind racing through logical explanations. Maybe Hendricks had gone to the bathroom. Maybe he'd moved to a different seat. Maybe Carlos had miscounted. But Carlos never miscounted. Car 6 was at the end of the train, separated from Car 5 by a connector passage that swayed and groaned with the train's movement. The sleeper cabins lined one side of the corridor. 6 small compartments, each barely larger than a closet, with a fold-down bed, a reading light, and a small window that looked out into whatever darkness we were passing through. Carlos stood outside cabin 3, his face pale in the corridor's fluorescent lighting. He'd been a conductor long enough to handle drunk passengers, medical emergencies, even the occasional belligerent rider. But this had shaken him. "Show me," I said. He opened the door. The cabin was immaculate. The bed was made with military precision, corners tucked, pillow centered, blanket smooth. The reading light was off. The small fold-down table was up and latched. On the narrow shelf above the bed sat a leather briefcase, closed and undisturbed. Everything was in its place, everything except the passenger. "This is exactly how it looked when I opened it," Carlos said quietly. "The blanket's still warm. Touch it." I reached out. He was right. The blanket retained body heat, suggesting someone had been lying there minutes ago, not hours. But the way it was arranged, perfectly smooth without a single wrinkle or depression, made no sense. No one could get up from a bed and leave it looking like it had been professionally made. "Walk me through it," I said, pulling out my phone to document the scene. "From the beginning?" Carlos took a breath, gathering his thoughts. Hendricks boarded at Grand Central, mid-40s, business suit, rolling suitcase, and that briefcase. Friendly guy. Asked about the route. Said he'd never taken the overnight train before. He seemed excited about it, actually. Said something about it being an adventure. Did he interact with anyone else? Not that I saw. He went straight to his cabin after boarding. I did my first round at 12:47, checked on all the sleeper passengers. He was reading on his tablet. I did my second round at 1:02, right before we entered the tunnel. He was asleep, lying on his side facing the wall. The blanket was pulled up to his shoulders. Normal sleeping position. And the third round? 1:19. That's when I found this. Carlos gestured at the empty cabin. Door was closed, but not locked from inside. I knocked first. No answer. Opened it and... this. I stepped into the cabin, careful not to disturb anything. The space was claustrophobic, maybe 6 feet by 4 feet. The window was closed and latched from the inside. I checked it anyway, pressing my hands against the frame, testing for any give. Solid. The glass was thick, reinforced, designed to withstand the pressure changes of tunnel travel. Even if someone managed to open it, which they couldn't, not from the inside during motion, we were traveling at 65 miles per hour. Jumping would be suicide. "His belongings are still here," I said, examining the briefcase without touching it. "Wallet?" Carlos shook his head. "I haven't touched anything, but look at the table." I looked. On the fold-down table's edge, barely visible, was a half-drunk bottle of water. Still cold, condensation beaded on the plastic. "He was here," I said, more to myself than to Carlos. "Recently." "There's more," Carlos said. He pointed to the floor. "Look at the pillow." I knelt down. The pillow on the bed was perfectly positioned, but on the floor, partially hidden under the bed frame, was another pillow. Not the standard issue train pillow. This one was different, darker. I reached for it, then stopped. "Don't touch it yet," I said. "I need to call this in." I stepped back into the corridor and pulled out my radio. "Dispatch, this is Midnight Express, Marcus Webb. We have a situation. Passenger missing from cabin 3, car 6. Currently in the long tunnel, 17 minutes past entry point." The response came after a moment of static. "Midnight Express. Confirm passenger missing. Have you completed a full train search?" "Negative. Just discovered. Cabin appears undisturbed. Passengers' belongings still present." "Understood. Complete full search of all cars. Report back in 15 minutes. Do not stop the train unless you have visual confirmation of the passenger." Carlos and I exchanged glances. The protocol was clear, but something about it felt wrong. We both knew instinctively that Hendricks wasn't on this train anymore. "Let's start the search," I said. "Check every cabin, every bathroom, every space large enough for a person. I'll take cars 1 through 3. You take 4 through 6. We split up. I moved methodically through the passenger cars, checking under seats in bathrooms, in the small equipment lockers. The few passengers still awake looked at me with sleepy confusion as I passed. Most were dozing, earbuds in, unaware that anything was wrong. Car 2, nothing. Car 3, nothing. I met Carlos back at the connector between cars 3 and 4. His expression told me everything. "Nothing," he confirmed. I checked the other sleeper cabins. Everyone's accounted for. I even checked the emergency equipment lockers. We stood there in the swaying connector passage, the tunnel walls rushing past beyond the windows, and I felt the first real edge of fear. Not panic. I'd been trained to handle emergencies. But this was something else. This was impossible. "Marcus," Carlos said slowly, "how does someone disappear from a moving train in a sealed tunnel?" I didn't have an answer, not then. But I was about to learn that sometimes the tracks lead to places that logic can't follow. We emerged from the tunnel at 1:38 a.m. The sudden wash of station lights felt wrong. Too bright. Too normal for what we'd just experienced. I filed my report with dispatch, kept my voice professional, and tried to ignore the way my hands were shaking. "Passenger unaccounted for. Full search completed. No signs of foul play. Cabin secured. Requesting investigation team at next major stop." The response was bureaucratic, clinical. "Understood, Midnight Express. Continue route. Investigation team will meet you at Pelham Bay. ETA 42 minutes. 42 minutes. I had to keep driving for 42 more minutes, pretending everything was normal while a passenger had vanished from a sealed compartment in a moving train. I didn't think it could get worse. I was wrong. 3 nights later, Thursday, I was back in the cab. Different passengers, same route, same darkness. The company had concluded their investigation of the Hendricks disappearance. Their official determination: passenger disembarked at an earlier stop. Conductor made documentation error. Case closed. They found security footage, grainy, time-stamped, showing someone matching Hendricks's description getting off at 125th Street. But I'd seen that cabin. I'd touched that warm blanket. And Carlos didn't make mistakes. Still, what was I supposed to say? That a man vanished from a locked room in a moving train? That sounded insane even to me, and I'd witnessed it, so I drove. That's what I do. At 12:47 a.m., Carlos radioed from car 6. His voice was different this time, not confused but terrified. "Marcus, it happened again." My blood went cold. "Which cabin?" 5, Mrs. Chen. She's... Marcus, the cabin looks exactly like Hendricks's did. I engaged autopilot and ran. Mrs. Chen was a regular. late 60s, and took the overnight train twice a week to visit her daughter upstate. She always brought knitting, always smiled when she boarded, always occupied cabin 5. I knew her face, knew her routine. The cabin was pristine, bed made with impossible precision. Her knitting bag sat on the shelf, needles crossed on top of a half-finished scarf, reading glasses folded neatly beside it. Everything in perfect order, everything except Mrs. Chen. Carlos stood in the corridor, his face gray. I checked this cabin at 12:30. She was knitting, awake. We talked about her grandson's birthday. 17 minutes later, I come back and I stepped into the cabin, same wrongness as before, same sterile perfection. But this time, there was something new. A smell, faint, chemical like ozone after a lightning strike. It hadn't been there in Hendrix's cabin, or maybe I hadn't noticed it. When did we enter the tunnel? I asked. 12:43. 4 minutes before I found this. My mind raced. 2 disappearances, both in sleeper cabins, both during the long tunnel, both leaving behind impossibly organized scenes. This wasn't coincidence. This was a pattern. Get everyone out of the sleeper cabins, I said. Now. Move them to the regular cars. I don't care if they complain. No one stays in car 6. Carlos nodded and moved quickly. I pulled out my phone and started documenting everything, taking photos from every angle. This time, I wasn't going to let dispatch dismiss it as clerical error. By the time we exited the tunnel, I had a plan. After dropping passengers at Pelham Bay, after filing another report that I knew would be ignored, I went home and pulled out every map, every schematic, every piece of documentation I had about the Midnight Express route. The long tunnel was the key. It had to be. Both disappearances occurred there. 15 miles of solid darkness, no stations, no maintenance access points, or so the official maps claimed. I spent the next day at the municipal archives, digging through old construction records. The tunnel was built in 1952, part of the post-war transit expansion. But the documents showed something interesting. The tunnel wasn't actually continuous. It connected several older passages, some dating back to the 1920s. There were sealed-off sections, abandoned platforms, maintenance corridors that no longer appeared on modern maps. The tunnel had layers, history buried beneath history. That evening I met Carlos at a diner near Grand Central. He looked like he hadn't slept. Neither had I. I interviewed passengers from Thursday night, he said, sliding a notebook across the table. The ones who were awake during the tunnel passage. Most didn't notice anything, but 3 people mentioned oddities. I flipped through his notes. A college student in car 3 reported hearing a sound, high-pitched, almost ultrasonic, lasting maybe 10 seconds. A businessman in car 2 mentioned a sudden cold draft, unusual for the sealed environment. And an elderly man in car 4 described a moment where the lights flickered and he felt, in his words, like the train went somewhere else for a second. Somewhere else, I repeated. That's what he said. He couldn't explain it better, just that for a moment the quality of the darkness outside the windows changed. I thought about Mrs. Chen's cabin, that ozone smell, the same smell you get near high-voltage equipment or after certain types of electrical discharge. What if it's not about people vanishing, I said slowly. What if it's about the train going somewhere it shouldn't? Carlos stared at me. That doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense. But think about it. The tunnel runs through old passages, sealed sections. What if there are gaps, places where the train briefly intersects with something else. You're talking like a science fiction movie. I'm talking like someone who's seen two people disappear from locked rooms. Carlos rubbed his face. What do we do? We map it, I said. Every detail of that tunnel passage, every sound, every temperature change, every flicker, we figure out exactly where in the tunnel this happens. And then we find out what's taking them. We drove the route every night that week, but there were no more disappearances. Maybe whatever was happening needed time between events. Maybe it was random. Or maybe it was learning, adapting, choosing moments we couldn't predict. On Tuesday, 7 days after Mrs. Chen vanished, I brought equipment: a thermal camera, a digital recorder, an electromagnetic field detector borrowed from a friend who ghost hunted as a hobby. Carlos thought I was losing it. Maybe I was, but I needed answers. At 1:03 a.m., we entered the long tunnel. I had the thermal camera running, pointed out the cab window at the tunnel walls. The EMF detector sat on the control panel, its LED display steady green. 12 minutes in, the detector spiked. Sharp, sudden red across all frequencies. 15 seconds later, Carlos's voice cracked over the intercom. Marcus, cabin 2, it happened again. Cabin 2 belonged to a passenger named David Reeves, mid-30s software engineer, commuting to Albany for a morning meeting. Carlos had checked on him at 12:52, awake, working on his laptop, earbuds in. 23 minutes later, gone. The cabin told the same impossible story. Bed perfectly made despite never being slept in. Laptop closed and centered on the fold-down table. Power cord wrapped with mechanical precision. But there was something new this time. Something that made my skin crawl. On the table, arranged in a deliberate pattern, were 3 playing cards. Not a random scatter, but placed with intention. The 7 of spades, the 3 of diamonds, the 2 of hearts. Face up, edges aligned, positioned to form a triangle. He was playing solitaire? Carlos asked, his voice hollow. No. I photographed the cards from multiple angles. Look at the laptop. It's closed. These were placed after he disappeared. The implications of that hit us both. Someone or something had arranged these cards after removing the passenger. A message, a signature, a game. I knelt and examined the floor. There, partially hidden under the table's edge, was a business card. David Reeves, senior developer, with a company logo and contact information. But the card had been torn, not carelessly, but with precision. Only the portion showing his name remained. The rest was gone. The pattern is evolving, I said, more to myself than Carlos. Hendricks, no objects left behind that I noticed. Mrs. Chen, her knitting in perfect order. Now this, cards arranged, business card modified, it's communicating. Communicating what? I don't know yet. I stood and checked the window. Sealed. The ventilation grate was screwed tight, and even if someone had removed it, the duct was barely 6 inches wide. I pulled out the thermal camera and scanned the cabin walls. Everything showed normal temperature gradients, except for one spot near the window. A cold patch, roughly circular, about 3 feet in diameter. The temperature difference was only 2 degrees, but it was there. Carlos, feel this. He placed his palm against the wall. Cold, like when you touch metal that's been outside in winter. The tunnel walls are concrete. They hold ambient temperature. This shouldn't be here. I marked the location with tape and moved to examine the cabin's ceiling. The light fixture was standard, but when I looked closely, I noticed something odd. The bulb had a hairline fracture, barely visible, running from the base to the tip. It still worked, but it shouldn't have cracked like that. Not from normal use. We sealed cabin 2 and continued the journey. At 2:15 a.m., after depositing passengers at Pelham Bay, I did something I'd never done before. I brought Carlos into the engineer's cab and showed him the data. Look at this. I pulled up the thermal camera footage from the tunnel. Watch what happens at timestamp 1:15:03. The screen showed the tunnel wall sliding past, the thermal signature consistent and predictable. Then, for exactly 2.3 seconds, there was a fluctuation. The wall appeared to ripple on the thermal spectrum, as if heat was being pulled toward a central point. That's when the EMF detector spiked, I said. What does it mean? I paused, trying to articulate something I barely understood. I think something opens. Not physically. The tunnel walls don't move, but something about that space changes, becomes permeable. Carlos rubbed his eyes. You're saying the tunnel is... what? A doorway? I'm saying that for a few seconds, in a specific location, the normal rules don't apply, and if you're in the wrong place when it happens, you go somewhere else. We spent the next hour reviewing every piece of evidence. The playing cards bothered me most. Why those specific cards? 7, 3, 2. Sequential, but from different suits. I photographed them again, zoomed in, and noticed something I'd missed. On the back of each card, barely visible, were small scratches. Not random wear, deliberate marks. A pattern within the pattern. The scratches formed numbers. 7.3.2. I pulled out my route map and measured. Mile marker 7.3 of the long tunnel. That's approximately where the EMF spike occurred. But what about the 2? 2 seconds. The duration of the thermal anomaly was 2.3 seconds. Close enough. That's impossible, Carlos said. How could Reeves know those numbers? He'd never taken this route before. He didn't know them. Whatever took him knew them. It's telling us where it happens. The revelation was both terrifying and revelatory. This wasn't random, it was precise, calculated, operating on rules we didn't understand but could maybe predict. We need to evacuate Car 6, Carlos said. Stop using the sleeper cabins entirely. The company won't do that. 3 missing passengers in 2 weeks? They'll call it statistical anomaly, bad record keeping. Hell, they've already decided Hendricks got off at the wrong stop. So what do? I looked at the cards again, at the cold spot marked on the cabin wall, at the EMF data showing that spike. We map it exactly. Find out if it's always mile 7.3. Find out if the duration is always 2.3 seconds. Find out what conditions trigger it. And then we figure out how to stop it. But even as I said it, I wondered if that was possible. Because the more I learned, the more I suspected we weren't dealing with a malfunction or a criminal. We were dealing with something that existed in the spaces between, something that had always been there, waiting in the dark, and we'd simply built our tracks through its territory. The playing cards sat in an evidence bag, their message clear but cryptic. 7.3.2, a location, a duration, a warning. And tomorrow night I'd have to drive through that tunnel again. Word spreads fast in a close-knit crew. By Friday, everyone working the Midnight Express knew something was wrong. Not the official story about clerical errors and passengers getting off at wrong stops. The real story. The one we whispered during shift changes and meal breaks. 3 people gone. Same location, same impossible circumstances. The atmosphere in the train changed. Carlos wasn't the only one who looked haunted. Maria, our backup conductor, started refusing to enter car 6 alone. Jim, the maintenance worker who serviced the route during daytime, asked to be reassigned. The cleaning crew complained about cold spots in the sleeper cabins, about doors that wouldn't stay closed, about the feeling of being watched in empty compartments. Management's response was predictable. Denial wrapped in bureaucracy. They issued a memo about maintaining professional composure and not spreading unfounded rumors. They suggested stress leave for anyone who couldn't handle the job. They did not, however, stop running sleeper service through the long tunnel. Money talks louder than safety. I implemented my own protocols. No passengers in car 6 between miles 7.0 and 7.5 of the long tunnel. I didn't tell dispatch, I just did it. Carlos would make excuses, guide people to other seats, delay cabin assignments until we'd pass through the danger zone. We couldn't evacuate the entire car without raising questions, but we could minimize exposure. It worked for 3 days. 3 blessed, uneventful days where everyone made it through the tunnel intact. Then came Monday. I'd prepared more carefully this time. The EMF detector was mounted on the control panel, constantly recording. I had a second thermal camera pointed at the tunnel ceiling, looking for temperature anomalies. My phone recorded audio set to capture frequencies below and above normal human hearing range. If something was going to happen, I'd document every second. We entered the tunnel at 1:03 a.m. with 41 passengers. 6 in sleeper cabins. Despite our best efforts, we couldn't stop people from booking them. I'd tried suggesting car 6 maintenance issues, but the company's booking system didn't care about a driver's concerns. At 1:14 a.m., we passed mile marker 7.0. I watched the EMF detector, my heart hammering. Carlos was stationed in car 5, ready to move if readings spiked. Mile 7.1, green across all frequencies. Mile 7.2, still green. Mile 7.3. The detector exploded into red. Not gradually, but instantaneously. Every frequency maxed out simultaneously, the display showing numbers that shouldn't be possible from natural sources. The thermal camera captured it too. A distortion in the tunnel wall, exactly where I'd marked the cold spot in cabin 2. The concrete appeared to shimmer on the thermal spectrum, heat signatures bending inward like water circling a drain. 2.3 seconds. That's how long it lasted. Then everything returned to normal. I grabbed the radio. Carlos, report. Silence. Carlos, do you copy? More silence. Then, finally, his voice, shaken, barely controlled. Marcus, cabin 4, you need to see this. I engaged autopilot and ran, my equipment forgotten. Cabin 4 had been occupied by a college student named Sarah Chen. No relation to Mrs. Chen, just a cruel coincidence. She was 22, traveling home for fall break, had shown Carlos photos of her dog during boarding. The cabin was empty, perfectly arranged. But this time there was no message left behind. No playing cards, no torn papers. Instead, the entire cabin was wrong. I couldn't articulate how, but every instinct screamed at me. The angles seemed off. The shadows didn't fall quite right. The air tasted metallic. Touch the wall, Carlos said, his face gray. I pressed my palm against the cabin wall. It was warm. Not the ambient warmth of heated space, but body temperature, as if the wall itself was alive. and beneath my hand I felt something, a pulse, rhythmic, slow, like a heartbeat, deep underground. "What the hell is this?" I pulled my hand back. "It wasn't like this in the other cabins," Carlos said. "This is new, it's changing." He was right. Whatever was happening was evolving, adapting. The first disappearances were clean, almost clinical. Now it was leaving traces, signs of something that didn't belong in our reality pressing through. I photographed everything, but the camera couldn't capture what we felt. The wrongness. The sense that this space existed slightly out of phase with the rest of the train. Like a room that had been copied imperfectly. We sealed the cabin and continued to Pelham Bay. I filed my report, attached the EMF data, the thermal footage, the audio recordings. I laid out everything, the pattern, the location, the exact timing. I requested immediate suspension of sleeper service through the long tunnel pending investigation. The response came within an hour. Denied. The data was inconclusive. The equipment was possibly malfunctioning. My request was not supported by sufficient evidence. Sufficient evidence. 4 people had vanished. And that wasn't sufficient. I sat in my apartment that morning, too wired to sleep, and realized something terrifying. They weren't going to stop the trains. Even if I could prove something was taking passengers, even if I could show them exactly where and when, the bureaucracy would find ways to deny it. Because accepting the truth meant accepting that we'd built our infrastructure through something we didn't understand, and that would mean liability, lawsuits, shutdowns. The system was designed to keep running, no matter what. Carlos called at noon. "I'm done, Marcus. I'm requesting transfer. You should too. And leave the route to someone who doesn't know about mile 7.3. You can't save everyone." "I can try." He was quiet for a long moment. "You're going to get yourself killed." "Maybe, but until then, I'm going to drive that train and make sure no one's in car 6 when we hit the danger zone." "That's not sustainable. Eventually, someone will be there. Someone will slip through your precautions." He was right, of course. I couldn't guard every passenger every night forever, but I could buy time. Time to gather more evidence, time to find someone who'd listen, time to figure out what was actually happening in that tunnel. That night, I drove the Midnight Express again. 43 passengers, 7 in sleeper cabins. I moved 6 of them before mile 7.0, citing vague mechanical issues. One refused to move, said he'd paid for the cabin, was tired, wanted privacy. I watched the EMF detector approach mile 7.3, powerless to do anything but bear witness. His name was Thomas Garrett, 56 insurance adjuster, returning from a conference in Manhattan. When I'd tried to move him before mile 7.0, he'd been polite but firm. He'd paid for privacy, he had work to finish, and he wasn't going to be inconvenienced by what he called superstitious nonsense. I couldn't force him. Couldn't tell him the truth without sounding insane. So I did the only thing I could. I monitored every instrument, every reading, ready to slam the emergency brake if something happened. Mile 7.3 approached. The EMF detector began its familiar climb toward red. The thermal camera showed the tunnel wall starting to shimmer. I grabbed the radio, ready to tell Carlos to get to cabin 1 immediately. Then something changed. The reading spiked higher than ever before. Not just red, but off the scale entirely. The thermal camera showed the distortion expanding, spreading along the tunnel wall like ink in water. And through the cab window, I saw something I'd never seen before. The tunnel lights ahead flickered in sequence, not randomly, but with pattern. On, off, moving toward us like a wave. And in that strobing illumination, the tunnel walls appeared different. Wrong. The concrete looked fluid, undulating as if the solid matter had become permeable. Then the train lurched. Not a normal mechanical lurch. This was lateral, sideways, as if we'd briefly shifted onto a different track that didn't exist. The sensation lasted less than a second, but it was unmistakable. We'd moved somewhere, then snapped back. "Carlos," I shouted into the radio, "check cabin 1 now." The response came immediately. "On my way. Marcus, what was that? Did you feel it? Just check the cabin." 30 seconds that felt like hours. Then Carlos's voice, different than I'd ever heard it. Not scared. Awed. "Marcus, he's still here." "What?" "Garrett, he's here." "But Marcus, you need to see this." I couldn't leave the controls while still in the tunnel, but the moment we cleared into open track, I ran. Carlos stood outside cabin 1, and his expression made my blood cold. Not horror, wonder mixed with terror. Thomas Garrett sat on his cabin bed, alive, conscious, staring at his hands. But something about him was fundamentally wrong. His movements were too smooth, like watching film at the wrong frame rate. His eyes tracked normally, but there was a delay, a fraction of second lag between stimulus and response. "Mr. Garrett," I said carefully. He looked up at me. Recognition flickered across his face, but slowly, processing. When he spoke, his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater, distorted by distance or pressure. "I went somewhere," he said. "It was only a moment, but I saw... What did you see?" His eyes unfocused. "The spaces between, where the tracks cross, there are others there, so many others. They've been there a long time. They're waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For the right frequency, the right moment. When we align." He looked at me, and for just a second, I saw something else looking out through his eyes, something vast and patient. "It's not taking people, it's trading them." Before I could respond, Garrett stood up. His movements were becoming more natural, the lag decreasing. "I need to go home," he said, suddenly sounding completely normal. I don't remember. What were we talking about?" Carlos and I exchanged glances. Whatever had happened in that moment at mile 7.3, Garrett had touched something, and it had touched him back. But unlike the others, he'd returned. Changed, but returned. We escorted him off at Pelham Bay. He walked away looking confused but unharmed. I never saw him again, but I heard rumors later. Stories about an insurance adjuster in Manhattan who started having episodes. Moments where he'd stop mid-conversation, staring at walls, whispering about spaces between spaces. After that night, I spent days reviewing all the evidence, the playing cards, the thermal footage, the EMF spikes, Garrett's cryptic words. I laid it all out in my apartment, trying to find the pattern within the pattern. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before. The items left behind in each cabin, when photographed and arranged chronologically, formed a map. Not a geographic map, but something else. A diagram showing points of intersection, like a circuit board or neural network. And at the center of that network, marked clearly, was mile 7.3. But there were other points too, other locations where the lines crossed. Other tunnels, other routes, other trains running through spaces where the boundaries were thin. The Midnight Express wasn't unique. It was just one point in a larger system, a vast infrastructure of thresholds we'd accidentally built. We'd laid our tracks through places that existed between, and now those places were learning to use our roots. The disappearances weren't random predation. They were experiments, tests. Something was learning how to interact with our reality, using our infrastructure as a bridge. And the passengers weren't being taken. They were being studied, processed. Some returned, changed. Others didn't return at all. I compiled everything into a comprehensive report. 50 pages of evidence, analysis, testimony. I sent it to transit authorities, safety boards, even contacted journalists. Most ignored it. Those who responded called it stress-induced paranoia. But one person listened. A researcher from a university I won't name, studying what she called liminal spaces, places where boundaries between states become permeable. She documented similar phenomena in other transit systems, other routes, other tunnels. It's not just your train, she told me over coffee. It's everywhere we've built infrastructure through liminal zones, subways, highway tunnels, underground passages. We've created a network of doorways without realizing it. Can it be stopped? She looked at me with profound sadness. How do you stop something that exists in the gaps, that operates between the moments we can perceive? You'd have to shut down half the transit systems in the world. So I keep driving. Every night the Midnight Express. Every night through that tunnel. I move passengers, I monitor equipment, I document everything. Some nights nothing happens. Other nights the readings spike and I hold my breath. 5 months since Hendrix disappeared. 7 confirmed missing. 3 returned, changed, and the pattern continues. I still drive the Midnight Express. 12 years on these rails. And I thought I knew every sound, every shadow, every stretch of track. I was wrong. You never really know a route until you understand what lives in the spaces between stations. Some nights, I wonder if I should have listened to Carlos. He transferred to the day shift 3 months ago. Hasn't looked back. Maria quit entirely. Moved to Philadelphia, works in a coffee shop now. Jim, the maintenance worker, took early retirement. The company replaced them all within a week. New faces, same route, same tunnel. I tried to warn them. Sat down with the new conductor, showed him the data, explained about mile 7.3. He listened politely, then asked if I'd considered talking to someone about the stress. That's what they all think. Stress, exhaustion, the mind playing tricks in the dark. But I know what I've seen. 7 missing passengers confirmed. 3 returned changed. And dozens more I suspect but can't prove. People who rode through the tunnel and came out different. Quieter. Their eyes focused on distances that don't exist in our geometry. The researcher I mentioned, Dr. Sarah Chen, yes, another Chen. The universe has a sense of humor. She published a paper. Got laughed out of her department. But she keeps investigating, keeps finding patterns. She says every major city has them. Threshold points where our infrastructure intersects with something else. London's underground has 3. Tokyo's subway system has 5. And they're multiplying as we build deeper, tunnel farther, push our networks into spaces that were never meant to be crossed. Last week, the EMF detector spiked at mile 7.3. No disappearances, no distortions, just the spike. Then nothing. It's learning restraint, perhaps, or patience. Or maybe it got what it needed from the exchanges and is simply waiting. I keep driving because someone has to bear witness. Someone has to document the pattern, monitor the threshold, move passengers away from danger zones, The company won't acknowledge it. The authorities won't investigate, so it falls to me. Tonight I'll climb into that cab again. I'll guide 300 tons of steel through the darkness, and at 1:15 a.m., somewhere around mile marker 7.3, I'll hold my breath and watch the instruments spike. Most nights we make it through. Most nights. But I always wonder, when I pass through that section of tunnel, for those 2.3 seconds when the readings go red and the walls shimmer and reality becomes permeable, am I driving the train through the threshold? Or is something else driving through us?